So that's being recorded. Thank you, Julie. Let's admit a few last stragglers. Okay, it's 10:32. Lucy, do you want to try and share your screen whilst I bring the last few people in?
Yeah.
And then we'll hand over to you. I think if we get time today, Henry would like to do a little piece right at the very end on who's going to be the next pensions minister. So that will be something to look forward to as well. So
I read your predictions this morning, Henry.
Oh, there you go. There you go. So, yep, I will. I've started the recording. I'll open up the chat. If anybody has any questions, don't hesitate to raise a hand and ask a question of Lucy. And over to you, Lucy. We'll start now. I think that'd be great. Thank you.
Hi. Well, thank you very much for having me today. I'm saying hello from a very, very windy Brighton. My bin was halfway up the street earlier, and my bird feeder is basically horizontal at this point. Anyway, just by way of background for anyone who doesn't know me, my name's Lucy Stone. I've been working at the regulator for just past 12 years now, in various policy and projects. I've been working on dashboards policy since 2017. And I now lead TPR's work on pensions dashboards. So that means effectively I run our internal projects, which covers everything from the guidance we put out through to the operations we're designing, and I report to David Fairs and then the board. So that's why I am relatively able to talk about dashboards. What I've done today is I wanted to not give you the standard basic presentation about what is dashboards and what you need to do, but actually go a little bit further, because I expect this audience will have a pretty good understanding of what dashboards are. So I want to talk about the strategic context. How did we get to where we are now, what we're doing about it, and then some kind of hot topics that are coming up in industry, because I think that's where the interesting discussion might lie. I'm going to try and do not a particularly long presentation, because I think the more important, interesting bit is the conversation and the questions. So here you go, jumping straight in. I mean, we all know why pensions dashboards are important. There are more and more people saving into pensions as a result of the hugely successful automatic enrolment. People's working lives are changing, so they'll have more roles, they'll have more pots. And also with the shift to DC and pensions freedoms, they actually have more decisions to make. So dashboards is intended to help with this, to reconnect people with lost pots and give them a picture of their savings. One thing I think is really important to say is that it's not a silver bullet. It's not going to fix pension engagement in and of itself, but actually it's part of a much bigger picture, including simplified statements, requirements to take advice before you transfer, money helper, in fact, the establishment of the single financial guidance body as was, but also money helper is doing a lot of work in this space and building a retirement hub, and has a bigger UK strategy for financial well-being. So dashboards won't fix things, but it will help. It will help people have all the information at hand so they can then go on and get guidance and advice. We are very supportive of dashboards at TPR. It links to several of our long-term strategic outcomes, including one about savers being able to better interact with their savings and accessing good guidance and advice. But also for us, it really is focusing the industry's mind on data and systems, something that historically possibly hasn't been the case. So we think that it's very exciting from that perspective. Do shout out questions as you go along, but hopefully it's self-explanatory. So progress today, I was reflecting on this. It's been a bit of a relay race. So if you think of government firing off the starting gun in budget 2016 and announcing rather ambitiously that there would be a dashboard up and running by 2019, and kind of putting the onus on industry to go ahead and develop dashboards. So, you know, industry there was a project led by the ABI, did a really good go of it and built a prototype which showed that the technology worked. But one of the things that was really clear coming out of that work was that it wouldn't work without compulsion. It wouldn't work if you don't mandate schemes do this. You wouldn't achieve sufficient coverage to make dashboards useful. So it went back to government for the next leg of the race. And indeed, at that time, that's when it moved from being HMT-led policy to DWP-led policy. DWP did a feasibility report, and then that fed into the development of the Pension Schemes Act 2021, which lays the sort of framework, the big picture, but then all the detail is actually in the regulations, which were consulted on early in this year and have been laid recently. And now we're over to industry for the last leg of the race, which is getting ready to meet their duties. I've mentioned that, so the regulations are laid. There's a few pieces of the puzzle that still are coming together. So DWP is setting the framework for occupational pension schemes. The FCA sets rules for personal pension scheme and stakeholder pension scheme providers. They consulted on this and they will be publishing the final rules imminently. They are also looking at the other end of the framework. So these are the rules for dashboard providers. So the people who will actually be building the apps and interfaces and websites that people can use to access their information. And that goes hand in hand with PDP. So the Pensions Dashboard Programme at MAPS will be consulting on the design standards. And between those, they sort of set the rules for what dashboards can and can't show and how they go about it. PDP consulted on all their other standards in the summer, and they'll be confirming what the final standards are soon. It's interesting to note they actually can't set the standards until the regulations are made, because it's the Secretary of State that signs them off, and he or she can't sign them off until the regs are in place, but they can publish them sooner. So call to action. At the moment, our call to action to trustees, I think there's a general narrative that we're trying to remind people, after all this time, 2016 to now, all the false starts, where we go, is this going to happen? The key message, it is happening. PDP have tested the technology and they're moving into the next phase of testing. So for trustees, we're saying this is happening, start paying attention to it. The first step is to understand what you're meant to be doing as a trustee. So read our guidance and learn your deadline, because that's the key, dates you need to hit. The major decision for most trustees is going to be around how they'll connect. So do they use their existing third-party administrator? If they are administered in-house, do they either build the technology to connect to MAPS directly, or do they get a third-party provider? So that's a very, very key decision. It's really important to keep an eye on this and have all the right governance in place, starting with having it as a regular agenda item on trustee boards. And the last, but certainly not least, is preparing data. So this is looking at both the data that people hold, that schemes hold on members, so they can match properly, but also preparing the value information, so the information they'll have to send on the value of the benefit. So there's a lot of work to be done there. In that context, what are we doing? So we recognise it's a lot of work. We recognise there is a lot to be done. So we're actually being very hands-on in communicating to industry and working with industry. We set out initial guidance back in June, I believe, but we've already updated it in July in light of DWP's consultation response, which confirms some of the policy areas. And we're also taking, I hate this word, multi-channel approach. So we're doing events like this, formal and informal speaking events. You will start seeing us in the press, in pensions media. We are working with key partners to share messages, including, for example, asking TPAs to share messages with the trustees. We're working with those schemes that we're already in a relationship with in supervision. We are talking regularly to the largest administrators, the largest TPAs, the admin software providers and these new integrated service providers to understand how they're getting on and where the issues are. And critically, we're going to be writing to every scheme at least, so the first letter will come at least 12 months before their deadline. But then actually they'll receive a series of letters around, I think it's around 7 to 8 months, 3 months and 1 month. And the message evolves, it sort of goes to, right, this is what you should do now, to this is what you should have done and what you should be doing now, and gets tougher as we go along to really help people keep on track. One thing I really want to highlight is that it's important that this communication is two ways. So in developing the regulations and all that, we try to anticipate a lot of what might go wrong, where the issues might be, but it's actually impossible to do that. And one of the things that was really instrumental to the success of AE is a real collaborative relationship between industry and the regulator. So we understand what are the issues that are emerging. We can support industry as industry develops its own solutions, or if it's something that we need to go and look at, we can. But it's really important that this is a conversation and that we understand what is going wrong, what is going right, so we can promote best practice. And that's going to be absolutely critical to delivering this, because to an extent we can't anticipate what might go wrong. So that's our kind of external facing work. Internally, we are also looking at, well, what does compliance and enforcement look like? It's going to be data led. So we will be getting information from the system that MAPS is building, both directly from the system. So for example, is a scheme connected by its deadline or not? But also there's some reporting standards that PDP has consulted on. So that's information that schemes will provide to, well, schemes and dashboard providers will provide to PDP, and then if it's relating to compliance, get passed on to us. And that will tell us both if people aren't complying, so are they not connected, but also where there might be risks and we need to look into deeper. The example I give here is, for example, if the NHS pension scheme over a period of 6 months returns 3 matches, that would be a concern. They have millions and millions of members. And if they only match 3, then there might be a problem with their matching processes. So this is the way we can sort of use this information. We're getting new powers and regulations. They are designed to operate at scale. So if we need to, we can issue multiple compliance notices. I'd like to highlight the third-party powers we're getting in there as well. So if we believe a third party is causing the trustee to fail in their duties, we can issue them with a compliance notice and penalty notices. We also have our existing information gathering powers. We can continue to use this, and we have other powers to look at wider governance issues. So if we discover there's something going on with the scheme which is much bigger than dashboards, we can use our regular powers, including, if needed, appointing or removing trustees. You'll be able to find more about that quite soon. Our compliance and enforcement policy has now been signed off internally. We're just waiting to publish it. So it will be going out for consultation shortly. But you know, spoiler alert, we really want to emphasize that we're going to be pragmatic. You know, as I mentioned, we know this is a big endeavor. We know there are things that are going to happen. So we'll be pragmatic, but we are going to be robust where we see willful or reckless non-compliance. You know, there's no excuse not to try and do this effectively. So that's a bit of the general background. I thought I might touch on what we're hearing, what we're seeing, what are the hot topics coming up in industry. So one thing, this is more of an observation, one thing we've seen recently in all our engagement is that there's really been a shift, which is great, from basic awareness, you know, people asking questions like, will state pension be included, to actually quite detailed understanding questions. So people asking us real questions about the technicalities, how does this work in practice? And that's really good because it means people are getting their head around this. We're hearing a lot, obviously, industry capacity is always a concern. In particular, the administration capacity is a challenge, and we know there's a challenge there. We also know that industry has the ability to rise to that challenge, but I think it's something that we will be keeping a very close eye on. I think there's a lot that industry does and can do to help with this. So we can urge trustees to talk to people as soon as possible, which helps manage and smooth capacity a bit. But also there's all the work of industry bodies such as PASA looking at data matching, which can help people manage their capacity, because, you know, if the data matching works, then they don't need to expend additional resource looking at or building different solutions if actually that works for them. So capacity is something we're looking at and we'll keep looking at and keep considering. The next hot topic, I guess, is DAP, or dashboards available point. So when dashboards will be launched to the public. And people keep asking, when's that going to be? And you know, what is going to be the criteria to decide. So DWP consulted on a requirement for the Secretary of State to give 3 months notice to industry. They've now confirmed it will be 6 months. And they're now going to be working with industry on what the criteria looks like. So what has to be achieved to launch to the public, issues around coverage and user experience and security. You know, I always find people, when they try and predict when, well, it's easier said than done. You know, I think it's really important that we get this criteria done. And then we can, you know, it might be that some people are staging earlier, so we achieve coverage sooner. Because of it, a lot of it is dependent on user experience and user testing. We can't really know until we do that testing. So I would not like to predict when, but obviously this is a hot topic. I think the ambition obviously is yes, there's the 6 month that the Secretary of State has to give, but it's actually to be a bit more transparent than that and keep a kind of, ideally give as much notice as possible. In more detailed and more specific, AVCs. So where the DB scheme has its DB benefit administered by one party and the AVC is administered by an AVC provider, how do you return that information to dashboards? They've got two options. They can either the domain administrator can get the information from the AVC provider and submit it to dashboards, or it can the trustee can get both the main administrator and the AVC provider to connect into dashboards. The infrastructure allows both scenarios, and it really comes down to how, you know, how it works now in terms of providing information to savers. But the main thing we try and get across is you need to remember that you've got AVCs and you need to talk to your AVC provider and your administrator to work out it's going to work for you. There is a question, an interesting question about how do you make sure matching is consistent. So if your main administrator is using one set of data to match to savers and the AVC provider might be recommending another, how do you make sure it's consistent and you don't have one appear, not the other? So that's an interesting thing to keep an eye out for. And also, how will users understand that these two things are linked? So PDP is proposing that there could be a little link element, so they could be shown together. Something I obviously get a lot of questions on is the interactions of dashboard duties with GDPR. And in particular, a big concern about what happens if you send data to the wrong person. And I'd like to say, you know, the whole system has been designed to be compatible with GDPR. It's consent-based, for one thing. So a saver has to provide consent for their information to be used to search for records. They can withdraw that consent at any time. And I think it's really important, something else in the framework which allows us those possible matches. So this is where you return information saying, yep, I think I've got a record for you, but I'm not 100% sure. Can you contact me? And that's actually really important for those cases where you're not quite confident it's the right person and you don't want to have a data breach by sending them information when actually it's not the right person. So possible matches are really powerful, and we think they'll be really helpful to kind of, you know, help where people are nervous about this because they're not confident they've got a match. So it will be important to use those. In terms of the regulatory framework, obviously, again, nothing new, because where there's data breaches before, obviously the ICO has a role, but it could indicate failures of internal controls or governance, something we're interested in. So we talk to the ICO about this. We're talking to them about how we're approaching dashboards, and we'll continue to do so. Nearly there, and then I'll stop talking and you can start talking. Administrators and integrated service providers, obviously very important. They've always been very important, but you know, this is another area where they're going to play a key role in trustees being able to meet their duties. You know, but the duties are on trustees, so it's really important they understand what needs to be done. They understand what their providers should be doing. They have the right controls around appointing and managing providers. We have information about that in our code of practice. But also we have these third-party powers I mentioned. You know, if we find that the failures are being caused by a third-party provider, then when we do have the option to use our powers there. So that's going to be a key aspect, how these third parties are helping trustees. Consumer protection, always a topic of interest. I've mentioned that it's a consent-based system. There's obviously an existing framework for consumer protection in FCA rules generally, but also those design standards I talked about earlier and the FCA rules for dashboard providers that will set more rules around, you know, what warnings and messages are provided, and there's a wider question about the framework around it, you know, the access to guidance and advice they can have. Estimated retirement income. So what is your projected income at retirement? This will be a big thing for DB. There's a lot of people, especially deferred values, they might not have it on their systems, or if they have it, it's when the member left. And there's a decision to be made for those schemes about whether they revalue in bulk ahead of their deadline or ahead of dashboards, or whether they calculate on demand, because you can have up to 10 days to provide in data. So a lot of people, I expect, will do a sort of mix. And there's an interesting question about the relationship to dashboard available point. So because there'll be fewer queries coming in before dashboard's available point, is it necessary to have all this information ready by then? I think it's worth remembering there will be testers before dashboard's available point. There will be people using it. The idea that MAPS has is to ramp that up to relatively significant numbers. And for those people, the duties will apply. You will have to return information. But it allows maybe to do the revaluation for the kind of 80% of straightforward scenarios ahead of connection, and then you've got a little bit of time for that to kind of try and automate those more complicated areas. And finally, the data. So we were starting to get questions saying, does this change, you know, TPR, your expectations on record keeping that you published a while back? And the answer is, you know, are the expectations changing? And the answer in short is no. The answer is no. It might change the scope of the data you look at. So the example of those DB schemes, they didn't have to have an up-to-date value for deferred members on their records, and now they do. So it might change the scope of the data they're looking at, but it doesn't change the fact that they need to look at it. They need to improve it, if you know, as appropriate. If not anything, it just kind of increases the importance of doing this work and finally paying data the attention it deserves. But our expectations remain as they were. So that was my overview. I am going to stop sharing my screen. I am going to look at the questions, the comments that Henry has been posting while I'm talking.
And he's raised a hand. So
and he's raised a hand. Excellent.
Okay, I just wanted to challenge your view that it was impossible for the dashboard to work without mandating it the way that it was, because it could have worked another way. The original conception would have been much more like the open banking route, where the CMA 9 were required to get their open standards in place and everyone else followed, and we got to a point where most people can see most things, and it's been a lot quicker and B, a lot less fuss than happens with the pension dashboard, or is happening with the pension dashboard. So my question is, in retrospect, would it have been better for the DWP to have kept their sticky mitts off the pension dashboard and allow the Treasury to see through their original conception, Lucy? Well,
you're really putting me on the spot already. That's I've come to expect from you, Henry. So if we take the reason I'm saying this would not have worked without compulsion is, you know, trustees have a lot of things they need to be doing. They need to, you know, times are tight. They need to be very careful where they spend their money. And this is quite a big piece of infrastructure. So realistically, would trustees have been willing to spend the large amounts of money that will be required to do this when there isn't necessarily a commercial incentive to do so, when they have to be careful where they spend their money? I think it would have been hard to get occupational pension schemes doing this. And you have to remember that some of them as well, especially public service schemes, some of them have a large proportion of their membership have this and the state pension. So there's even less incentive for them. I think if you're operating in the automatic enrolment space, you would probably have got them on board. But I think for some of the other schemes, I would suspect a lot of trustees just wouldn't have been willing to spend the money. That's my view, not TPR's official position. Would it have been better if the Treasury have kept hold of it? It's an interesting counterfactual, as you say, but obviously I can't comment. I have to say, I think it was important to position it in the wider context of everything else that's happening in pensions and all the other initiatives I mentioned about simplified statement, etc. And that, in a sense, is easier within DWP. But as I said, as it's a counterfactual. We'll never know. We'll never know.
Yeah, I guess what you're saying is inclusivity is really important, and that's this dashboard availability point thing. But people won't reckon it's much of a dashboard if they can't see 100% or close to 100% of their data, yep. which has always been the DWP view, but it's not been the view taken by the CMA on open banking. So, I just put those two things out there because they're not the same, and there are different views about it. And it does inform on the dashboard availability point, because my personal view is that the dashboard availability point inevitably will be too late. It already is too late. But, yeah. So, but that's a dynamic which is out there, but which doesn't get much discussed.
Yeah, although I would say part of the feasibility report, there's been quite a lot of user testing. MAPS has done quite a lot of user testing, and in this testing, and this is testing where you get real people in a lab and you observe them, and it was very clear that they want to see, most or well, as close as all as possible. That's what they're interested in. They're not that interested in a partial thing. So yes, I think we should probably move to the other topics. That's all right.
Thanks, Henry. Let's move to Gareth, who's just raised his hand, and then we have other questions. So, Gareth, do you want to go next?
Yeah, thanks, Dave. But briefly, I have to say committed to the idea of it all has to be there, or the whole thing is useless if you can't rely on the data being where you need to find it. I've got a different kind of fundamental question. We were talking to the Pensions Minister last year about the data that comes out from this and what you can do with it. And he said, I think rather shockingly, that it had been decided that there was going to be no way of exporting or sharing the data, so that other kind of applications, people, systems that could make use of that data as a part of their presumably increased accuracy would just not be able to get any access to the data at all. It just sits there and you can't do anything with it.
So data access and portability is a complicated subject. You'll see in the DWP's consultation they sort of acknowledge how complicated it is. I'm going to pass the buck on that one and say it's something that I think will come out in the FCA's consultation for dashboard providers, sort of because they are setting the rule for dashboard providers. So it'll be interesting to see where that goes. But yes, I mean, it is interesting because on the one hand, if you can download it and share it, it puts you at more risk. But on the other hand, it's also a principle in GDPR, access to your own data. So I obviously can't comment on what the minister said at the time.
Lucy, just following on from Gareth's question then, when you're saying you're doing lots and lots of human, real people testing in a lab, does that therefore mean that, are you listening to them? I mean, if they're playing around with this baby in testing format, are you listening to them? If they start saying, well, what happens next? Or can I, move that out to some platform I use or whatever? Are you listening to their feedback, or is it just, a one-way street? What's the view there?
So I'm personally not listening to them. This is done by the team at MAPS. And yes, they are going to be looking at, what do people do with this information? At the moment, they've been sort of looking at, what tolerance there was for partial picture and looking at things like what forms of presentation work for people, but you know, the user experience is going to be key, and there's going to be a lot of testing on you know, how do people react, and yes, you're listening to someone who's effectively talking about, you know, how they approach it, and narrating what they're doing and what they're thinking. So it should be really interesting.
Yeah. Okay. I've got another question. Sorry to interrupt you a little bit. You mentioned about the NHS and 3 people would be a bit unusual. So what criteria are you using? When you said matching flags, are you suggesting that a scheme should return a certain percentage of members per annum? What percentage are you assuming?
No. Again, matching is one of those really interesting things, is we almost won't know until we see it happening in practice. And MAPS is working with a next set of early connectors, effectively, who will be doing some testing. There'll be some testing with live users. And it will be really interesting to see what works in practice and how people work. So it's a complicated area, because basically you're trying to prove either that someone should have been found when they weren't, or that they were found when they shouldn't have been. And short of us going and looking at every single scheme, that's going to be a challenge. But what we can do, as I say, is first of all, we'll be looking at the big picture. We'll be looking at, okay, roughly how many users are there, therefore how much, you know, matching would we expect from a scheme of this size. So that's all information we can use. We'll be looking at patterns of how many match maids are they returning versus possible matches, you know, and how is possible match evolving over time. So it's a really difficult question to answer. Like, what we're trying to do is make sure we've got all the data so we can start looking at this, but I can't tell you exactly what it will look like. But so that's why I give a very extreme example of, obviously, if there was a huge discrepancy between the number of hits we might expect for a scheme that size and what we're getting, then that would be a clear-cut case. But the more nuanced cases, I think we're going to be working through over the next few months. We don't quite have the answer to that yet.
Okay, perfect. Padraig, Floyd, you've had your hand raised for a little while. Then we come on to Sophie. Padraig, do you want to?
Yes, thank you. Can you hear me?
Yep.
Great. Lucy, thanks for that. It's a very interesting presentation, and a good deal more meat to it than anybody else I've spoken to on dashboards over the years. But can you give us an idea of how confident you are you think this program is actually finally going to get delivered? Because I've been writing about it for more than a decade, long before it was kicked off in 2014 as a concept, and I'm still confused, but also concerned by the fact that it's split between FCA, TPR, and the Great White Elephant of Holborn. That concerns me greatly when I understand that there are different responsibilities, but I think part of the reason it never seemed to get anywhere before this was because nobody really seemed to have control, and without control, you can't see these projects through. So, you know, that was my question.
Excellent. So confidence that will happening. I have to say, I've only been involved for 5 years. It is an immensely complicated thing to try to achieve. I think a lot of people at first were like, well, the international experience shows, you know, you can do it, etc. But the international experience was always a country of 400 providers. It's like, well, we've got 30,000 on our side, let alone, you know, if you had the FCA as well. So it was complicated. There was a lot to work out. The technology it has taken time to work out. The legislative framework has taken time to work out. You know, MAPS, as I said, they've tested the technology. They're making changes. They're moving to next phase of testing. So it is proceeding, and they've shown they can get, you know, the information flowing from a data provider, so a pension scheme, through to a dashboard provider, and they'll be doing more of that in the months to come. There's been a huge, I think, acceleration in momentum in recent months. So I'm, you know, I'm relatively confident. I think we're getting there. That personally, you know, the framework's getting there. The framework, you know, the technological framework and legislative framework is there, and those were the two big barriers, effectively. And now that's there, we can move on with it. And it will come down to things like industry capacity, etc. Again, I've got great faith in industry rising to challenge. I have seen that time and time again. As for the dual regulatory framework, obviously the regulatory framework is a matter for government, but we regulate occupational pension scheme, FCA regulate personal pension scheme providers. The one thing I'd try and give reassurance on is all these parties work very closely together. So I speak to my colleagues at MAPS and FCA probably 15, 20 times a week. And who knows how many emails in between. We have, we have forums on which we share planning, and we talk about risks, and we talk about comms, and we talk regularly about our various things we're developing. So there's a lot of coordination happening behind the scenes that people aren't necessarily aware of. We work together very, very closely with DWP and FCA and MAPS and ourselves. So if that hopefully will provide some degree of reassurance that we are coordinating and working together. Don't know if that actually answered your question.
Yes, thank you.
Excellent. Sophie Turner, have you got a question for Lucy?
I do indeed. Thank you. And thanks, Lucy. That was really, really interesting. I suppose my question goes back to the fundamental kind of purpose of this enormous project that you've been working on. With when you mentioned, it's around kind of reconnecting savers with their pension savings. And if you kind of look at other countries that have implemented a dashboard or a platform, whatever they may call it. So I'm thinking of kind of Sweden or the Netherlands, Denmark. A lot of the data that's come back from those countries is that the individuals that are engaging with their dashboard equivalents are kind of the one it's almost like they're preaching to the converted, for want of a better expression, and that the ones that are engaging with the platforms are those that have the highest pension contributions and those who are perhaps nearing retirement. So I suppose my question is kind of to what extent now is it being kind of considered how we ensure that the pensions dashboard is going to target those individuals that really need to reconnect or even begin their savings most. So, those in so-called kind of pension poverty, and those where saving isn't a priority, especially in the kind of current environment that we're in. To what extent is that kind of comms piece being thought about ultimately to achieve the purpose of this huge piece of work?
Yeah, absolutely. So the comms piece is being considered. So again, I mentioned, across these, what we call internally the delivery partners, so FCA, TPR, etc. How do we get the word out there to that, dashboards and then can be used, and as you say, and doesn't reach the usual suspects? And I think there's lots of different parties have a role to play. So obviously dashboard providers themselves might want to advertise their dashboards. Money Helper will have a role to play. DWP may have a role to play. We at TPR were thinking about, okay, well, is there something we can get trustees to promote to their members, or employers indeed, because we've got all the relationships for automatic enrolment, and employers are often a really good way of getting to people. So that's being looked at the moment, because DAP is not around the corner this year. It's not been nailed down yet, but absolutely being thought about. It's a good point about people living in pension poverty, because as you say, especially in a context of very tough financial decisions having to be made by people, on a strategic view, it's like, obviously contributing to your pensions is vital, especially to avoid poverty in pensions, but where's the line where actually you would be better off? So for example, if you have enormous amounts of debt, should we really be going to people, oh well, you should be investing in your pension, and actually enormous amounts of personal debt, that's the thing. And this is where it's really important to bring in the bigger picture about financial well-being and Money Helper's role, because Money Helper looks across pensions and everything else, and all the wonderful contacts that the support they can provide. And it has to be in that wider picture that we need to look at it. So again, not sure if I've answered your question, but just to reassure, yes, it is something that we are looking at. Yeah.
Thanks, Sophie. Another quick question. You mentioned about the powers and penalty notices and that sort of thing. if a scheme or a third-party administrator is using a non-regulated firm who's nothing to do with the FCA or the regulator or anybody, how far do those powers go? I mean, how much power do you have if you've got some sort of fintech company in Wrexham who's cocked up, or excuse my French, or ballsed up, or whatever it is? What power does the regulator have? Actually, in real time, in real terms, what power do you have, Lucy?
So our third-party powers are effectively, we can issue a compliance notice. So we can say you must take these steps or refrain from taking these steps. We can then issue a penalty notice if they don't follow through that. So we can fine up to £5,000 for an individual or £50,000 in other cases. Don't forget, with dashboards, there might be multiple penalties. So if they do things repeatedly, or if it's a member-driven event, and that happens a lot, so you know those fines could rack up. It's also really important to not underestimate the power of our publication powers, so we can talk about past cases. So that, I think, will be important. You know, if we end up taking some random fintech from Wrexham to court, you know, well, imposing big penalties on them, and we talk about that publicly, that other people will think twice about using them. So it's worth it's that as well. I would underestimate that kind of leverage. What we can't do, obviously, is, you know, ban them from operating. But I mean, at the moment, all the people involved are sort of who I'd expect to be involved. But obviously, it's something we will keep an eye on as well.
Yeah, I appreciate that. Okay. My last question is about this connection. You mentioned connection deadline. Can you sort of expand a little bit more on that? Presumably, as you said, I think you were talking about the larger schemes first and the smaller schemes at a later date. What does that mean, connection deadline?
Yes, I can indeed very quickly share a slide with you. If that's, oh no, I don't have it. I can send it around to you afterwards. But effectively,
okay, yeah.
One of the lessons learned from automatic enrolment is that you can't get everyone to stage on the same day. We can't have everyone have the same deadline for schemes. We've got to, at the regulator, we're looking at 3,000 pension schemes who need to connect. Operated by hundreds of administrators, and there's a dozen software providers there as well. So the approach is staged, with people having different deadlines, so similar to AE. It's based on scheme type, but also size. And it was developed looking at quite a lot of data as to how, you know, it was meant to balance coverage, so how many memberships they had, but also ability to deliver. So a good example is DC schemes used for automatic enrolment. Our evidence shows that they typically have, they're more likely to have good record keeping behaviours. Their systems are often newer, whereas, you know, DB schemes, you know, might need a bit more time to comply. So all that was taken into consideration by DWP. In fact, first PDP did a call for input. MAPS did a call for input on that, again, working very closely with FCA and TPR and kind of looking at our evidence. And that's what's gone into DWP. And so effectively, it starts with the largest master trusts, so the master trust with over 20,000 members, and then moves into the other DC schemes used for automatic enrolment. DB schemes, the very largest, will go from, so their first deadlines are August 23. DB schemes' first deadlines are November 23. And it works its way through, and then up to in September 24 you get the public service schemes, and that ends the kind of what we call the large schemes, so anyone of 1,000 memberships or more. And then from October 24 to October 25, medium schemes will stage, and that brings us to the end of the current staging profile. So I've got a slide which shows that, which I will send to you because that's quite helpful.
Yeah, really interesting.
And FCA providers, again, when FCA publishes their final rules imminently, that will be in there. But the idea in the initial consultation was to align with the largest master trusts. So
excellent. Thank you very much, Lucy. That's good.
Oh, and sorry, just say on our website, you can go and find all that. It's all in our guidance. So if a scheme can look themselves, it can work out like, okay, I am a master trust with X thousand members. This is my deadline. So we're offering very hands-on thing. And as I said, when we write to people, we say, based on our data, this is your deadline.
Okay, and you touched upon this as well. Sorry to hog the questions, but we all remember the Monster advertising campaign. Will there be some advertising for the general public to hear about Dashboard? Is there a PR campaign including radio or TV advertising? Is that on your agenda, Lucy?
Are you trying to get worky out of retirement? Is that the so as I said, it's something that's being looked at the moment, what that will look like. The communications to members, I think, there's roles to play for employers, for trustees, for money helper, for dashboard providers, and is there a big campaign? I don't know the answer to that, but we're looking at all the various options out there to make sure the message gets out in the best way possible.
Yeah. Okay.
Maybe Big Zoo would like to do a little pension dashboard rap.
Hey, why not? Commission him to write a dashboard rap. Why not?
I never thought I'd see the words grime and pensions in the same sentence. I saw that was like. But yes.
Well, there we go. Oh, Bob, you've got your hand raised. Would you like to ask a question?
Yeah, it's just a simple one. I was thinking about how many people would you expect in the course of a year to be accessing the pension dashboards that when it's fully working, and what constitutes success?
So on how many people a year, I'm not the right person to ask that. I can go off and look at what DWP have estimated for their impact assessment. That's probably the closest I can tell you. So I can come back to you on that. But there were some estimates done based on proportions of people with pensions, international experience, etc. So there have been some estimates done, and I can dig those out, and I'm sure they must be somewhere in the DWP's consultation response, so I can find those for you, but I don't have them off the top of my head. Sorry, I'm failing in my dashboards nerddom. Sorry, your second question was about
what constitutes success?
What constitutes success? Right. So that's an interesting one. So DWP has, I believe it's 6 policy objectives. And that's sort of their view of what the policy needs to achieve. So it's around reconnecting people with lost parts, people demonstrating greater engagement with their pensions. I can't recall them off the top of my head, but again, they are into DWP's consultation documents. You can find them. So those are the kind of 6 policy, I think there's 6, but they're the policy objectives for that. What constitute respects from the regulator's perspective? Our work is focused on maximising compliance of trustees with their duties. What we see as success is, people are connecting, those connections work well, and they are providing the right data to the right savers. That's very much our focus in that area. So I think we all have our own bits to play, parts to play in this role. PDP will have its own version maps. Who's building the system, they'll have their own. It's important to know that in the background to this, as I said, we work closely together. We also all have our own measures and metrics and reporting mechanisms and controls as well. So we have our views, we're building at the moment. What are critical success factors? What is it we're trying to achieve? And also our measures as we go along. So what does good look like in terms of connection compliance and where we're trying to get to on that. So my TPR success is that trustees meet their duties and are connected and are able to find the right people and return the right information to them.
Can I make a comment? I think auto enrolment has been a big success, but on a very low contribution base, and there's a real need for people to realise that the current minimum levels of funding for a DC pension is minimal and won't actually provide an adequate income in retirement. I know that looking at adequacy of levels of contributions from employers and employees may be going up at some point, mid-2020s or whatever. But the pensions dashboard, when it's fully working, I think a real criteria for success will be if people take on board that actually their pensions that they've actually got that are tracking that are going to be delivered when they eventually want to retire, which could be by the time they get to retire could be late 60s or early 70s. They need to save more. So I think if the dashboard can improve the rate of saving that individuals make or employers make on behalf of their employees, that will be a success. So I think if you get some benchmarks going that track where things are at the start and where things could be in 5 years' time and in 10 years' time, etc., that would be a criteria for actually achieving something really quite remarkable.
Yeah, absolutely, you're right. And I think we all want to see pensions adequacy. But as I mentioned right at the beginning, is dashboards part of that, but it's only part of that. It might, hopefully it will let people look at it and go, oh, actually, I'm not on track for having the retirement I was hoping for. What can I do about it? And then go and take steps. But I think ensuring adequacy is a bigger and complicated issue. And it's linked to all the things like cost of living and all those areas as well. So I'm always nervous when people think that dashboards will fix lots of things. Dashboards is a tool which will help with a lot of things. And so it's important that we keep that big picture and think about, the long-term strategy as well. And keep looking at all those questions as well. But dashboard itself, if that's the way you define success, then it's almost impossible to have a dashboard that succeeds. There'll be other things that need to happen.
Definitely there will be, but it will be a measure of how successful the dashboard has been. If people realise that they're actually underfunding their retirement, if they want to retire at, say, at 65, or they want to retire at 70 or 75, if they've got some target income they want and they realise they're not going to get there because the dashboard has given the information to show that, which over time it will show that, then people will start saving more when they can afford to do so. But if we've got the current economic conditions and it gets worse, then we can forget about saving for retirement. We'll just carry on working till we drop. Okay.
Yeah, no, absolutely.
Thank you, Bob.
That's a very good point.
Thank you.
Good point, Bob. Really appreciate that. Lucy, thank you very much. Hopefully you'll stay on just to hear a little bit more about Henry. We've got a few more minutes to go, Henry. Do you just want to quickly touch upon your views on the next pensions minister? And then we'll do the official thank yous to Lucy. But do you want to just say a few words about the pensions minister? You're on mute, Henry.
Yeah, sorry, I had my hand up to ask Lucy another question.
Sorry, go on.
And then that question was, Lucy, Steve Webb intimated that he didn't think that the DWP would be able to offer state pension information unless there was a national insurance number. And he said that the national insurance number is not going to be a mandatory field for people's completion on the dashboard. Is there a worry that an awful lot of people won't fill in their national insurance number and therefore won't get what the state is due to offer them, which is a state pension, not forecast, but a statement?
Yeah, and it's also something that's been raised by industry. National insurance number is going to be a thing. So let me explain. It will be asked of members. They don't have to provide it. I'll have to go back and confirm, but I believe the reason for that is an equalities consideration, that it's not mandated, but I'll go back and come back to you on that one. It will be strongly encouraged. If people don't fill it in, it will say, actually, inputting this will really, really increase your chances of being found. So it's strongly encouraged. One of the things PDP has been looking at is this, and in practice they find that people are putting it in, but obviously it's something they will continue to test. And if down the line that's not the case, the standards aren't necessarily, the standards are meant to evolve. So if down the line there is a problem and people aren't inputting their national insurance numbers, MAPS can look at their standards again. But at the moment, there's this strong encouragement to input it. And of course, we're finding that in practice, people are inputting it. That hopefully will mean that in practice, national insurance numbers are provided.
Okay, that's a good answer. Thank you very much for that. It puts my mind at rest. I was going to say something about the state, about the Minister of State situation. And a lot of people have been asking me what makes me feel so confident that Laura Trott is our new pensions minister. And I would refer them, I spent an hour of my lunch break listening to the DWP's questions and answers session yesterday afternoon to a couple of comments which make it absolutely clear. First of all, Laura Trott says during that meeting, I am committed to taking up the work of my predecessor, the Minister of Hexham. Yeah, now that is the job of Pensions Minister. The Minister of State for Social Security, Guy Opperman, then says, in a former life, yeah, I could have answered that question on auto-enrolment. Yeah, so it's quite clear there's an interchange between the two. Now, you do not give all the pension questions to be answered to a parliamentary Undersecretary of State unless you've got good reason to do. It was quite clear in that question and answer session that Laura Trott was being given all the pension questions. Mins Davis was given a whole load of questions on benefits. Guy Opperman was dealing with all the questions to do with labour and universal credit, and Mel Stride was providing an oversight, with Jonathan Postgrove providing questions on disability. Yeah, you don't have to be a genius to work this out. Why the DWP are holding their cards close to their chest, I don't know. Presumably they feel they have to get some kind of exactitude on roles or whatever. But having been through so much grief and hassle over the summer about who's doing what and whatever, I just thought it would be clear and helpful to people to understand that there is no doubt, absolutely no doubt, that Laura Trott is going to be the next Pensions Minister. So that's the end of my statement on this.
Thank you, Henry. Are you taking bets?
I would. Anyone who
right,
wants to bet me anything from £5 to £50, even money, on Laura Trott being the next Pensions Minister, I'm happy to take it. Hands up.
There we go. That sounds an interesting bet to have. Okay, Lucy, I really appreciate your fantastic presentation today, and thanks everybody for their input and questions. That was very useful. If you could send that slide as well about the dates, that'd be great, and I can send it out to all that were on today's session.
So what I'll do, Steve, is I'll add it to the deck. I also corrected a couple of typos, so I'll add it to the deck and I'll just send you the updated deck and you can send that around.
Thank you very much indeed. Really appreciate that. So that's fantastic. Next week we have the FCA talking on consumer duty and other strange things. And a date for your diary, the 22nd, Tuesday the 22nd, we have Anne Daniels, who some will know is the first woman to have explored and visited the North and South Pole. She's going to be talking on her experience and also motivation and life generally. So she's our guest speaker on the 22nd. So if you can put that in your diary, that's Anne Daniels, Polar Explorer, will be on the playpen. So I'm really looking forward to that as well. FCA next week. I hope you've enjoyed the session. Lucy, thank you very much indeed. Really appreciate your time and your input. And thanks everybody for joining. And as we usually say on Pension Playpen, can't believe it's now the 1st of November. Let's pray for peace in the East, which we've been saying since, well, yeah, a long time ago. But thank you very much indeed, and appreciate everybody's time, and enjoy the rest of your day.
Cheers.
Thank you
very much. Take care.
Bye.
Bye.